Jerusalem, their nation. How God moved on King Cyrus to aid the Jews to be led by Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the broken walls and restore the worship of God and the equality of all mankind is still a miracle. This act of tolerance and respect for religious diversities has set a precedent for future civilizations. Similarly, in the Greek and the Roman Empire, same have been the case. And then we come to America, the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And I have to admit, I as a radical young man who was a member of the Movement for Justice in Africa, began to study Martin Luther King and Marcus Garvey, his braveness in their belief, and Richard Allen that all men are created equal, that nobody should be taught to be subservient to anybody, which goes back to the text that I studied with. God created male and female and said, let them, verse 28, had dominion over the fowls of the air, over the fish of the seas, and over every creeping living thing. God's intention was not for man to rule over man because of the color and the context of their skin. No. God did not create man to rule over women. I know some of you want to disagree with me, but I believe that God created man to work together as equal with mutual respect, and so that when we do that, we create a society in which there's peace and stability and mutual respect. Richard Allen and a few of our founders refused to be subservient to anybody, especially in the house of God. That led them to form what is now known as Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, one of the tourist centers of the United States of America. They started in a blacksmith church because they refused to succumb and embellish the teaching that was not biblical. And James, the great theologian James Cone, the original theologian, put it this way: that no man or woman should never be seduced or pressured into thinking and believing that they are second class. Every individual, male or female, black or white, are supposed to have the belief that we were created, all of us, to become sons and daughters of God, and to worship the way we want, and to not be intimidated or discriminated against because of one's worship and one's belief. The First Amendment that Corbett dealt with of the Constitution guarantees the free exercise of religion and prohibits the establishment of a national church. This unique experiment in religious freedom has allowed diverse faiths like ours, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, to flourish, even during the time of slavery. They stood up for right and righteousness, not just for black men and women, but for all of humanity. That they refuse to be intimidated. They refuse to accept a second-class citizen, second to anybody, anywhere in the world. Well, the church took on a whole new meaning for me, because I believe I came from a tribe that we were the leaders, or my great-great-grandparents were the leader of our area. And my father and grandfather taught us never to be subservient to any individual, any race, any power, any municipality, any leader, because you are created to be as bold, as brave, and as important as anybody else. My dad always used to remind me, some, not because you're smart, that you're better than the rest of your students. You have to know that you all are equal in the sight of God. Religious liberty for me is realizing that we are all created in God's image. And when we work together, when we hold each other accountable, so that no group, no individual, no institution will try to dehumanize another group, our liberty becomes the liberty of all. Because when one of us are in trouble, we are in trouble. We are in this together. We are in this boat together. And if we will all work together, we all can succeed. We all can grow. There'll be peace and stability. I'm a living witness. I have no right sitting here talking to you. I came from a society that messed up some 20 years ago. We started killing each other out of greed. But I'm here to tell you that we made a wrong turn. But people like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and many church leaders who are joined and privileged to be among have been able to tell everybody that tribalism is wrong, that nepotism is wrong, that looking down on somebody because of their faith, the way they practice and worship is wrong. Those attitudes create confusion, and that's how Liberia got into this barbaric, uncivilized civil conflict that lasted for 200 years. I want to commend the United States of America. This country, like any other country, had made some mistake, but this country has the right and the ability to correct itself. I want to end with this. I was against the Confederate flag. I was, as a student and as a graduate student. But I saw how South Carolinian, for me, when I came in 1978, this was the best place to be. I have just as more white friends as I have black friends, and I would commend this state for me. I did not know much about racism because this state took me in. And whatever I am today is because of South Carolina, not just black, but both black and white. So in conclusion, religious liberty is a fundamental human right that has been the cornerstone of free society throughout history. From ancient civilization to modern democracy, the freedom to worship, to believe, to practice one's faith has been essential for individual dignity and social inclusion and global stability. So I thank you for inviting me to be a part of this, and I pray that South Carolina and South Carolina and South Carolinians will always show the good side that made me to choose South Carolina home away from home. There is no state better than South Carolina, because if you find a prophet church, let me know. I won't go there because I'm not prophet. But South Carolina has done an excellent job in bouncing back and being an inclusive state for all of humanity. God bless you and thank you so much.
Honored to have you take your schedule to be here with us today. Thank you and your sweetheart for being here. And boy, I show joy in you and acknowledging that I'm married to one of those women that is more brighter, talented, prettier, and than I could ever be. But I'm also from the other state that has a palm tree on the state flag. And it's way colder in South Carolina than it is in Florida. But thank you. What great energy you have brought to this conference. I would now like to introduce George Clare as president of the Aiken Muslim Association and is a retired engineering operations and project manager and corporate executive in the nuclear power, safety and security, and nuclear cleanup industries. I like him already. In retirement, he leads a nonprofit organization whose mission is to develop housing for the homeless. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming George Clare to the podium.
Thank you, Elder Amos. I want to thank the organizers of this conference. I know Alan and Cheryl, and I'm sure there are others whose names I don't know, but God The answer is that the Prophet Muhammad, who was being persecuted in his hometown, was invited to go to the town now known as Medina to help bring peace to the area, which had been plagued for decades by vicious and violent scuffles between the collection of various tribes, Christian, Jewish, pagan, and other tribes in the area. Skipping lots of details, what's important from a religious liberty standpoint is that Muhammad developed what's called the Charter of Medina, or the Medina Constitution. In it, he described the rights and responsibilities of each of the major tribes, each with the right to practice their own religion freely, manage their own internal affairs according to the laws of their religion, and they were equal before the law if there were any inter-tribal issues. It was a model document for the time, and it exemplified the Quranic teachings of religious liberty. Now, I put a link to the charter in the speaker resources tab on the conference webpage. Let's advance to the year 637. What happened in 637 that reflects on how religious liberty was practiced? Mr. Van, no, not on this one. The answer, that's my point, by the way, the answer in 637 is that the second caliph of the Muslim world, second after the death of Muhammad, that was Caliph Umar, was invited to take over from the Byzantine Christians who were currently at that time ruling Jerusalem. The Jews in Jerusalem were firmly convinced that they would be treated better by the Muslims than by the Christian Byzantines. The Byzantines surrendered without a fight, and Muslims ruled over Jerusalem for 1,300 years. The Jews and Muslims living together quite peacefully until the 20th century. Yes, there were some ups and downs during the Crusades, but that was just a blip. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 40,000 Jews thriving and living peacefully in Muslim-ruled Jerusalem. Okay, the next question, third question, is what happened in the year 711 CE? Something that offers guidance on how to practice religious liberty. Anybody know it? Come on. No? Okay. That's 2 points for me, 1 point for you. In 711, Muslims from North Africa invaded the Iberian Peninsula and drove out the German Visigoths. Over the next 8 years, Muslims developed their caliphate in most of the area that's currently known as Spain and what was then known as Andalusia. Muslims were obsessed with learning and in particular with books. They established then modern libraries, including one in Cordoba that had 600,000 volumes. Probably a record at that time, not sure. They established universities in Cordoba, Granada, and Seville. But what's the importance to religious liberty? The importance is that there were scholars, including Christians and Jews in large numbers from all corners of the earth, who came to Andalusia to study, to translate books, and eventually to be the foundation for the Enlightenment in Egypt, in Europe. Again, of course, there were ups and downs, twists and turns, but nonetheless, folks studied and learned together for 7 centuries. Nonetheless, the Catholic Spanish royalty slowly pushed the Muslims and Jews out of the Spanish territory. And in 1492, their Inquisition resulted in expelling most of the remaining Muslims and Jews out of the country. And I've just They went there because they knew in the Ottoman Empire that they would be welcomed and that they would be treated with respect and allowed to practice their religion freely. Now, why would Muslims be so invested in religious liberty? We talked about examples spanning from the 7th century to the 15th century. Why are Muslims doing this? The answer is simple. The Quran, our holy book, revealed to Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, says in various chapters, let there be no compulsion in religion. It says to you is your religion, to me is my religion, and God knows best all that you do, and God will be the judge between you on the matters in which you differ. That's saying we're not going to be the judge. He's going to be the judge. And finally, the Quran says, when you're discussing, or you might say debating, with those of a different religion, reason with them in the most courteous manner. No more need to be said. Here's question 6. What happened in the year 1452 that impacted religious liberty? Well, maybe the bishop would know that answer. He's going to look it up on his phone. Well, here's a hint. Okay? Father Newman, it involved the Catholic Pope. Do we know? No. 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 Well, maybe it did, but that's not what I'm talking about. 1452. The answer is that in 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a decree telling the King of Portugal, among other things, quote, we grant you full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers, and to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. Now, at least he didn't say the slaves couldn't practice their non-Christian religion, right? But it did set the stage for vastly expanded slave trade, which is the subject of our next question. Question number 7, changing formats, it's a two-part question, you get half a point for each answer. Slaves were brought from Africa here for over 335 years. Part 1 question, in total, how many slaves were brought here from Africa? Now you gotta know those, that. Did I hear an answer?
I said 13,000.
More than that. What's now the U.S., the colonies, and then the U.S. Sorry? 500,000 is pretty close. The real answer is just less than 400,000. But close enough, we'll give you that point for whoever's keeping score. Okay? Now, part 2 of the question is, what was the dominant religion of the slaves when they arrived? Yes. Now, in Africa, they actually had many different religions, animist religions, pagan religions, a number of things. But the largest, the most dominant group were the Muslims who had come down from northern Africa as traders and whatnot, and folks who converted. It's estimated that up to 30% of the slaves that came from Africa were Muslim when they got to our shores. So now our 8th and last question, again in 2 parts. The Bill of Rights, replete with freedoms, including freedom of religion, was adopted in 1791. How many free persons lived in South Carolina in 1791? And the other part is how many slaves lived in South Carolina in 1791? A whole bunch of South Carolinians who we don't know our history. There we go. Way more slaves? No, actually, that's not true. Although some people might be inclined to say the slaves were a small fraction. There were 107,000 slaves and 142,000 free persons. What that means is 34,000 slaves in South Carolina, that's about 14% of the total population, were either Muslims when they arrived or were descendants from Muslims. They might have been Muslim like their mommies and daddies, just like people of other non-persons, and nobody paid attention to any of their rights. But the second thing is that the slave masters, most of them, and there were some exceptions, the slave masters did their best to prevent the slaves from practicing their Islamic faith. The Muslim names were changed to so-called Christian names. They were not given places to pray. They were not given time for the 5-day prayers. Many were forced to attend Christian churches. The First Amendment says, Congress shall not pass a law, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't say anything about slave masters or anybody else. You know, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution says that it was interpreted by the Supreme Court. It doesn't say explicitly, but it was interpreted to mean that state governments are held to the same standards as the federal government in terms of the Bill of Rights, but still there is nothing that says that individuals in this country have to respect each other's religious liberty. Let's turn to more or less current events. What about the so-called Muslim governments that don't support religious freedom in their countries? Take in particular the poignant example of ISIS, the radical jihadist group, so-called, that 10 years ago took a very violent approach to some of the religions, minority religions within their control. It's very simple. It's the same phenomenon that led the presumably Christian Lord's Resistance Army in Central Africa to commit murder, abduction, mutilation, child sex slavery, and recruitment of child soldiers, that's the list from Wikipedia, in order to create a country bound by the Ten Commandments. It's a case of power-hungry madmen using religion as a prop to motivate followers who might not otherwise fight for their path. The facts are that ISIS was not Islam, and in 2014, a group of some 122 Muslim scholars and leaders from around the world issued what's known as the Letter to Baghdadi. Baghdadi was the leader of ISIS at that time. It criticized much of what ISIS was doing, including forcing individuals to convert to Islam. The letter pointed out the faults that so many ISIS actions were contrary to the precepts of Islam. I don't have time to go into the details here, but I put a link to the letter in the speaker resources tab. What about my experiences relative to religious liberty? It turns out that my wonderful wife is a native of Turkey, and we spend considerable time there every year. Turkey has a 90+% Muslim population, but with a nominally secular government modeled after the French. All religions, including the large majority Sunni Muslims, are subject to government control. But with a huge difference in populations, it's sometimes difficult to imagine that the minority religions are seeing the same treatment as the Muslims. On the other hand, there are churches and synagogues in the major cities, and adherents worship their freedom. Recently, the government has even supported the construction of new houses of worship for the minorities. Now, there also have been a few attacks by misguided people against churches and synagogues, but they are far fewer and with lesser consequences than those in the U.S. In 2014, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision that so-called legislative prayer at the beginning of a government body meeting, is acceptable under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, even if the prayers are predominantly and overtly Christian. In 2022, as a Muslim, I was invited to offer a prayer at a meeting of the Augusta Commission just across the river from South Carolina. I accepted the invitation and offered a prayer. Inviting a Muslim, and presumably other minority religions, to offer legislative prayers is a good sign that the Augusta Commission in Georgia is not trying to make an end run around the Establishment Clause. I don't know what government some effort, it's possible for liberals and conservatives to find common ground on controversial topics and recommend actions to address those topics. Our most recent effort considered the teaching of religion in public schools. We recommended that the concept of religion, which it turns out many youngsters don't understand, should be taught, along with the moral lesson of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is common to many, if not most, religions, with variations in word. A description of cross-currents and the public statement of our findings on teaching religion are provided in the speaker's resources. As a final note, both Muslims and Jews report rapidly increasing verbal and violent attacks across the U.S. Some Christian churches are also targets. Unless they include mass killing, such attacks against individuals or houses of worship are almost commonplace, attracting little or no media attention. How can our nation put up with frequent violent sectarian attacks and still claim that we are a nation? How can we allow these things to happen? Verbal attacks are generally not crimes. They are protected by the First Amendment, and that's probably a good thing. Physical attacks that cause harm to people or property are crimes. But the criminals who commit them don't seem to be fearful of being caught or punished by the judicial system. Just as the First Amendment didn't protect Muslim slaves 200 years ago, it offers nothing to deter Islamophobia-driven attacks or anti-Semitism-driven attacks today. What can be done about this? One answer, and apparently the best answer, is to establish so-called hate crime laws that significantly increase the punishment for crimes that are motivated by hate, including religion-based hate. South Carolina is one of only 4 states in the entire country that has not taken that step to improve religious liberty for all of us. People toss out various reasons as to why hate crime laws might not be a good idea. But with a tiny bit of knowledge and rational common sense, it's readily apparent that those issues are nothing but a smokescreen. Just one example. Some people claim that hate crime laws would endanger freedom of speech. But hate crime laws don't criminalize actions that are not covered by existing laws. It only investigates and judges the motivation for crimes that are already defined elsewhere. Speech is protected by the First Amendment. It's obviously not a crime and would not be affected by a hate crime law. There are other, similarly unfounded, red herring issues raised by those who aren't interested in improving religious liberty for all Americans. Maybe we'll hear something positive about hate crime law from our state officials this afternoon. Wouldn't that be refreshing? Thank you.
Thank you, George. In true engineering tradition, I just like the way you took your jacket off, rolled up your sleeve, and jumped in. Well, I would now like to introduce J. Scott Newman, who was born in Elkin, North Carolina in 1962. He studied at Princeton University, the Catholic University of America, Belmont Abbey College, and the Pontifical Georgian University in Rome. He holds degrees in philosophy, sacred theology, and canon law. Newman was an atheist from the age of 13 until his sophomore year of college, and he became a Christian in October 1981. The following year, he was received into the Catholic Church, and in July 1993, he was ordained to the priesthood of the Diocese of Charleston, which includes all of South Carolina. Newman has served as a Catholic chaplain to the Citadel, as pastor of 5 parishes in South Carolina, and as a professor of canon law at the Pontifical College Josephium in Columbus, Ohio. Father Newman became pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenville in 2001 and dean of the Greenville Deanery 2021 and 2011. Since 2023, he has also served as the Chancellor and Conical Counsel of the Diocese of Charleston. Thank you for being with us today, Father J. Scott.
The first week of my freshman year at Princeton, I became an active member of Dr. Chu, of the still extant American Whig Society, and which Madison joined as a freshman. And then later in that year, my friends and I formed an insurgent newspaper called the Madison Report to advocate for the ideas Madison had advanced from his undergraduate years, including this one. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for the redress of grievances. That, of course, is the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, and acknowledging the 5 freedoms named in the First Amendment was a revolutionary idea in the 18th century, as it still is a revolutionary idea today. Think of how many nations on earth do not have, even now, true freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And then perhaps it is easier to understand the extraordinary human wisdom of the founders and framers of our republic. But even here, we have never stopped arguing over exactly what these freedoms are and what they are for. And at the root of our many disagreements is a dispute about whether these freedoms are privileges granted by our government or are instead natural rights that come from the requirements of human nature itself. If these freedoms come from human nature itself, then in the First Amendment, our government is not granting privileges that it can later revoke by amending the Constitution again. Instead, the Constitution is simply acknowledging the consequences of human dignity and delineating the ways in which a just government must respect the intrinsic liberty of its citizens. And yet, 234 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified, we still face a constant struggle in our legislatures and courts to sort out precisely what is entailed by these simple words. So, in the service of helping us do that sorting well, perhaps a quick review of history is in order. The Pilgrims who established the Plymouth colony were Protestant Christians seeking religious freedom, but they were not fleeing the oppression of Catholic tyrants. They were rather fleeing the intolerance of other kinds of Protestants. The long disputes among the Lutheran, Zwinglian, Anglican, Calvinist, Anabaptist, and nonconformist movements in the first 2 centuries after Martin Luther ignited the Protestant Reformation saw as many conflicts within the several worlds of Protestantism as between Protestants and Catholics. But of course, Protestant-Catholic disputes were the most ferocious and horrific. The 30 Years' War, for example, waged between 1618 and 1648 was one of the most brutal and deadly conflicts in European history. And it was driven largely by the effort to decide with violence on the battlefield what had not been decided by reason in pulpits, lecture halls, or throne rooms, namely, which construal of Christian faith and life would be the basis for organizing the life of nations, Catholicism or Protestantism, and if the latter, then what kind of Protestantism? One attempt to resolve that dispute came 60 years before the outbreak of the 30 Years' War at the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, and the proposal for peace was the principle that each ruler would decide which form of Christianity would prevail in his realm. The Peace of Augsburg was meant to end wars of religion and promote religious tolerance, but that settlement, unfortunately, did not last long. To describe this effort, a Protestant lawyer in the 17th century coined the phrase cuius regio eius religio, meaning whose realm is religion. But, as demonstrated by the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, and the persecution of Puritans by other peaceful settlement of religious differences, in part because the very idea of religious belief and practice was undergoing a dramatic development throughout the European world. That development continued in the New World, and by the time the First Amendment to our Constitution was composed, the principle of religious liberty, adopted by our founders and framers, could perhaps best be stated this way. The government of the United States will have no religion, so that every citizen of the United States can have whatever religion he or she chooses. The basic idea is that if the people are sovereign, rather than a prince or parliament of whatever sort, then each citizen is his own ruler. Hence, cuius regio eius religio takes on a new meaning. Whose realm his religion means here that each person can choose his own religion in a sovereign exercise of his own conscience, over which he has liberty of thought and action, so long as his actions do not impinge on the same liberty of others in our shared republic, the res publica, or public entity of political life. Now, in the 18th century, the Catholic Church did not welcome this new idea, because it was at first indistinguishable for most Catholic thinkers from the vastly different settlement of religious disputes offered by the French Revolution. In that case, it was not that the French state would be indifferent to religion so that all citizens could have their own religion. It was rather that the French state would be implacably hostile to all religions because the Jacobins argued religion itself is a fundamentally irrational force in human life that must be kept out of the public square by state action in order to keep the peace of public life. Only with time would it become clear to Catholic pastors and intellectuals that the two approaches to religion of the American and French revolutions were essentially different. And by the mid-20th century, the Catholic Church was embracing the notion of religious liberty as enshrined in our First Amendment as the most fundamental human right after the right to life itself. During the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, which met in Rome from 1962 to 1965, the Catholic Church expressed its commitment to religious freedom in a declaration called Dignitatis Humanae, meaning the dignity of the human person. That teaching document declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right. So, the Catholic Church teaches today that religious freedom is both a natural human right and a civil right that every society must acknowledge and protect in law. And in 1995, Pope St. John Paul II took this same message to the United Nations when he spoke to the General Assembly in New York on the 50th anniversary of the UN's founding. John Paul said, "Our respect for the culture of others is rooted in our respect for each community's attempt to answer the question of human life. And here we can see how important it is to safeguard the fundamental right to freedom of religion and freedom of conscience as the cornerstones of the structure of human rights and the foundation of every truly free society. No one is permitted," John Paul concluded, "to suppress these rights by using coercive power to impose an answer to the mystery of man." And now we come to what some regard as the primary threat to religious freedom in our time. Many people in our republic seek to resolve a deep dispute about the mystery of man by imposing on others their view of human nature with coercive power, by legislation when possible, and by litigation when not. We can call this a crisis of anthropology, understood in the philosophical sense. And so we must ask, what is a person? In the 6th century, Boethius said that a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. And this definition was offered to describe both the divine persons of the Trinity and all angelic persons, in addition to human persons. Building on the ancient Greeks, Christian philosophy has typified by Thomas Aquinas identified a human person as a substantial unity of body and soul. And this reflected the biblical teaching that the human person is created by God in his own image and likeness as male and female. In biblical religion, the human person is therefore intrinsically connected to bodily life, which is the first principle of our individual existence. And the human body always exists as either male or female, as a biological fact which is discovered and not decided by individual choice. In this vision of humanity, we are not spirits temporarily encased in bodies like birds in a cage. We are rather enfleshed spirits or embodied souls who exist as a unity in such a way that our bodies disclose our personal identities, both to ourselves and to others. So our bodies are not merely the tools of our real selves to be used, modified, and cast off as we please. No, our bodies are essential parts of our personal identity through which we relate to all others in order to exist in communion with other persons, including with God himself. But this is not the vision which inspires much of postmodern thought. Think of one of the literary conceits of all science fiction. If we but had the right technology, we could take the real me out of my body and put it in another vessel without doing violence to my true self. And if that new vessel happens to be female, while my original vessel was randomly male, then no essential change has happened. The sex of the body in this view has no greater bearing on human identity than the color or amount of hair on someone's head over the course of their lifetime. Then to this anthropological confusion, add the contemporary tendency to reduce the ample freedom of religion to the narrow freedom to worship, and the path to tyranny appears at the heart of our republic. For example, if the freedom of religion does not entail the right to organize the public life of religious institutions according to religious doctrine, and if human persons are not substantial unities of body and soul, then churches which refuse to permit or acknowledge same-sex marriage will eventually be punished by law, and any society which declares that the sexual friendship of two men or two women is no different than the sexual friendship of one man and one woman. Or to take another example, communities of religious women like the Little Sisters of the Poor will be punished by government if they do not include provision for abortion or contraception in the healthcare plans of their lay employees. Or to take a third case, schools which attempt to restrict access to athletic teams or restrooms to persons of one biological sex will be punished for denying the rising postmodern conviction that it is a basic human right to decide for oneself whether one is male or female, or some hybrid gender that changes according to desire. Or to consider a fourth issue. If people are not free to pray and discuss the reality of religion in human life in schools operated by government boards, then does that not constitute the prohibition of the free exercise of religion by unjust laws? And is it just to penalize parents who want a religious education for their children, but are forced to pay also for government schools where that is forbidden? To return to Pope St. John Paul at the end. In a just society, no one is permitted to suppress the rights of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience by using coercive power to impose an answer to the mystery of man. And yet for 3 generations and more, the trend of political and judicial activists, particularly on the left, has been precisely toward a regime of coercion by imposition, as we have seen in the notorious Supreme Court cases of Roe v. Wade, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, Obergefell v. Hodges, and others. If the government of the United States is to have no religion, so that every citizen can have whatever religion he or she chooses, then we must constantly recall to our fellow Americans that the First Amendment does not grant freedom from religion, but freedom for religion, even in the public square. In fact, most especially in the public square, since religion is by its nature a public activity of communal relationship, and not, as the Jacobin mind mainly imagines, an irrational force of distinctions in the proper way and making our laws accordingly will lead to an ever freer and more just society in areas like the right to life, recognition of marriage as a unique relationship in human affairs and its essential distinctions from other forms of sexual friendship, the proper place of sexual identity in human and civil rights, provision for the support of education with public funds in all schools, even those sponsored by religious groups, and the safeguarding of conscience rights for all, for cake bakers, doctors and nurses, and every citizen of whatever religion who interact with other citizens of different religions or no religion. And perhaps the best way we continue to search for a more perfect union is to return constantly to the wisdom of James Madison and the First Amendment. Accepting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof, or of religious freedom, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Newman. That was an inspiring opening. I would like to now introduce Rabbi Yossi Refson, originally from England, moved to Charleston with his wife, Sarah, in 2007 to establish Shabbat of Charleston, Center for Jewish Life. Together they have come to love the Charleston community. Sarah, who serves as co-director, works alongside Rabbi Refson in outreach and community programs. The Refsons live in Mount Pleasant with their 4 children and are grateful for the opportunity to serve and be a part of South Carolina's faith community. Thank you for joining us today, Rabbi Refson.
Good morning, friends. First of all, thank you to Judge Clemens for inviting me today. I'm humbled to stand before you. I admit I'm probably the least qualified on this panel to speak here. However, this topic touches on something which is deeply personal to me. My maternal grandfather was imprisoned in Siberia for the crime of teaching Judaism under Stalin's oppressive regime. His mother, my great-grandmother, equally committed to preserving our faith, was executed for her defiance. Their stories remind me the incredible cost of religious liberty and the sacred duty we all share to protect it. Religious liberty is not simply about the right to worship. It is the foundation of a truly free society. With it, and without it, human dignity is diminished, and history shows us that societies that suppress faith inevitably descend into tyranny. Today, as we face both ancient and modern threats to these sacred principles, we must renew our commitment to ensuring that religious freedom endures for future generations. The story of the Exodus reminds us that the suppression of religion has always been a tool of tyranny. Moses first approached Pharaoh. His request was simple: let my people go so that they may serve God. Pharaoh's refusal to let the Israelites go was not only about keeping his labor force, it was about denying them their spiritual freedom. He feared that allowing them to worship would give them hope, dignity, and a connection to a higher authority than his own. The same strategy played out across history. During slavery in America, enslaved peoples were often forbidden to gather for prayer or for worship. and through diminishing literacy, access to the stories like the Exodus were deliberately curtailed. Slaveholders understood that faith could ignite a yearning for freedom, just as it had for the Israelites in Egypt. Yet in hidden places, hushed harbors under the stars, and whispered hymns in the fields, enslaved peoples reclaimed faith. They found religion as a source of resilience and a vision for a better future, proving that even under the harshest of oppression, the human spirit, guided by faith, cannot be extinguished. This Exodus teaches us, the story of the Exodus teaches us, that true freedom is not simply the absence of physical chains. It is the ability to serve a higher purpose, to connect with something beyond ourselves. Without this spiritual freedom, physical freedom is very often hollow. Today, we face a dual challenge when it comes to religious liberty. Firstly, there is religious intolerance, where discrimination comes from a dominant faith or ideology that seeks to suppress or marginalize other faiths. This can lead to violence, discrimination, and to the erosion of a pluralistic society. Second, there is intolerance of religion itself. Driven by radical secularism, this movement sees faith as an obstacle to personal autonomy and to societal progress. But this ideology misunderstands what freedom really means. Freedom is not the absence of restrictions. It is the ability to choose what is right. Judaism teaches us that animals are free to follow their instincts, but humans are free to rise above them. As the Bible in Leviticus commands, proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. Liberty is not the license to do whatever we want. It is a call to live with purpose. To live with purpose, to live with responsibility, and to live with meaning. The radical secular agenda, in seeking to strip religion of its public sphere, threatens to replace it with a new orthodoxy, one that books no dissent. And this is not freedom. This is another form of tyranny, cloaked in the language of progress. These two forces, religious intolerance and intolerance of religion, are both deeply connected. Both seek to silence voices who challenge their vision of absolute control, and both threaten the foundations of a free society. Pharaoh's Egypt was not the last society to suppress religious freedom. History offers countless examples of regimes that sought to silence faith, and in doing so, extinguish other freedoms, and usually all other freedoms. Take the Soviet Union, for example. Stalin recognized that faith posed a threat to his totalitarian rule, as it created a framework outside of the state's control. He closed synagogues, banned Torah study, imprisoned religious leaders, including my grandfather. His regime sought to replace God with state, creating a system where human life was devalued, dissent was crushed, and millions suffered. Or consider Nazi Germany, where religion was either co-opted or suppressed and perverted to serve the goals of a regime. By stripping away the moral values rooted in faith, the Nazis created a society where unspeakable atrocities could be justified. The Holocaust stands as a chilling reminder of what happens when a society abandons the sanctity of life and the divine image in every single human being. In every case, suppression of religious liberty was not the end. It was the beginning of tyranny. When governments seek to control the soul, they inevitably seek to control the mind, the body, and then the spirit. A free society cannot exist without religious liberty. Faith provides a moral framework upon which all other freedoms depend. It teaches us that we are accountable to something greater than ourselves, reminding us the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. This principle was eloquently expressed by George Washington in his 1970 letter to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island. He assured them that in America, the government gives bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance. Washington understood that protecting religious freedom was not only a matter of justice for the Jews, but a cornerstone of a thriving democracy. Today we must ask ourselves, are we living up to that vision? Are we creating a society where faith can flourish? Are we allowing ideologies to erode the foundations of our true freedoms? When I was in rabbinical school in Brooklyn, New York, there was a bakery called Lowen's Bakery. The proprietor was a Holocaust survivor called Yankel Lowen. He survived the Nazi concentration camps, and he would tell his story to whoever would listen at least once. And he would always start off, you know why I'm here today? I was just a teenager. And I was taken to Auschwitz. And one night, we were in the cattle cars, in the box cars, and it was freezing cold. And I noticed an elderly man from my hometown who was shivering uncontrollably. He looked terrible. So I wrapped my arms around him and began rubbing his arms, his legs, his face, his neck, just to try and keep him warm. All night long, I worked to warm this man. I was freezing myself, but I didn't dare to stop. When the morning came, the sun started shining through the cracks in the boxcar, and there was a deathly silence. I looked around and realized that everybody else had frozen to death. The only survivors were me and the elderly man. He survived because I kept him warm. I survived because I was warming him. As brothers and sisters in faith, let us stand united, knowing that by safeguarding each other's beliefs, we will ultimately protect the spiritual foundation of humanity. Let us proclaim liberty throughout the land, for in doing so we uphold the dignity of all, preserve the essence of our own individual faiths, and preserve the essence of the faiths that shared humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Refson, and also thank you for sharing those personal stories. I would like to now introduce Holly S. Moore. She's the Executive Director for Cherry Hill Seminary, Chair of Interfaith Partners of South Carolina, and was the first regional lead for disaster spiritual care for the American Red Cross in South Carolina. She often teaches public groups about pagan religions, has served as regional resource for law enforcement, victim services, and others since 2004, and frequently appears as a guest speaker or panelist. Moore is the author of the Constellated Ministry, a guide for those serving today's pagans. Thank you for sharing with us today, Ms. Holly S. Moore.
Thank you and good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to address you today on a subject which stirs particular passion in me. I bring greetings, first of all, on behalf of Interfaith Partners of South Carolina, which is currently celebrating our 14th year of South Carolina Interfaith Harmony Month, with events around the state from a plethora of religions. Judge Clemens suggested that I perhaps share some personal stories of my interfaith experiences today. That's something I love doing because I found South Carolinians to be a fascinating religious montage, a mix from whom I'm constantly learning. So let me start by telling you that I was raised a good Lutheran girl, had aspirations to some kind of ministry, regularly visited the synagogue of my childhood friends, picked up steam in the early 70s with the Jesus movement, and was part of a house church in North Carolina, and then the Episcopal Church, until moving to Columbia. So here I have sojourned with the Episcopalians, then the Unitarians, and the Metropolitan Community Church, before finding my spiritual footing in contemporary paganism. And no, that does not mean we don't have a religion. It's an academic term for a whole group of religions. With that background, you can see that religion and the right to explore, learn about, and practice the religion of my choice has been a defining characteristic of my life. I like to think that my ancestors would be pleased. Some of them fled the religious wars of 16th and 17th century Europe. Some were Calvinists, some Huguenot. In the centuries before them, I know of many Catholic ancestors, Russian Orthodox, including one saint, Muslims, pagans from Scandinavia, all the way across the continent and across North Africa. My foremothers and fathers, being some of the original settlers of this country, I'm quite sure that their variety is a good illustration of the rich heritage that all of us possess. But let me tell you a modern story, an interfaith story. It dates to September 11, 2001, and has haunted me since my friend shared it with me years ago. My friend Avi is Sikh. He wears a turban as part of his faith. On 9/11, he was standing in the driveway of his Bend, North New Jersey home in a suburb when he got a call telling him the awful news. As he stood there, he noticed a neighbor staring at him. Now, you may be aware that in the days after 9/11, a Sikh man was murdered at a gas station in Arizona. The first person believed to be killed in retaliation for the attacks because his killer declared he wanted to, and I quote, go out and shoot some towel heads. When Avi told this story, he insisted that any bias the neighbor may have had towards him was Avi's fault. Now, when I stridently objected to this idea, Avi said, no, it's true. At the time, I was thinking, Avi said, he doesn't know I'm not a terrorist because I've never taken the time to reach out and get to know him. Never taken the time to reach out and get to know him. Just let that sink in for a moment, and we'll come back to that connection thing in a little bit. Now I find myself at the helm of a group that originally listed my religion on our meeting agendas as other. Don't ever do that. My interfaith colleagues have become some of my dearest, most trusted and beloved friends, and I'm happy to see many of you here today. I've learned some of the most critical lessons of my life during my years with IPSC. And here's what I tell other pagans about interfaith now. When people who are part of a small and misunderstood minority faith get a chance for equal representation with the big guns, we think, yeah, finally people will find out we're not crazy and they can learn something about my religion, which I think has happened, hasn't it? Then before long we reach a next stage and we say, gosh, I'm learning so much about other religions, even those I thought I understood. Stuff I could never have learned in a classroom or by reading a book. And then there comes the stage in which we comprehend why interfaith activity could save our lives someday. At a gas station, in a skyscraper, or right here in our own state. But only if we have the freedom to reach out to each other from our various religions. In the world of interfaith, we tend to embrace a kaleidoscope of diversity, and we believe in the value of a pluralistic society. Interfaith leader Eboo Patel points out that diversity is just a fact of life in America, neither good nor bad. However, when left alone, it tends to isolation, as we tend to congregate with our individual tribes, which he says can manifest in these 3 B's: bunker, barrier, and bludgeon. There's the bunker of isolation, primarily concerned with preserving one's own traditions, and that may cause us to be afraid or suspicious of anyone that's not in our bunker. There's the barrier of division, where we may believe that our way is the only right way. And instead of avoiding somebody different, we may insist the other is wrong or even offensive, and maybe even take action against them. Then there's the bludgeon of violence, representing a very small minority in every religion, unfortunately. People in this kind of isolation may intentionally accentuate differences and silence and intimidate others. And I would add another B, the blunder of assuming that we understand someone else's religion, or assuming that they're too small to matter. Some of you may have read the groundbreaking book, Falling Alone, first came out in 2001, The Collapse and Revival of American Community by Robert Putnam. He showed extensive research on how Americans had stopped joining, stopped participating in everything from bowling leagues to churches. And a few years later, a sociologist named Bill Bishop published The Big Sort. He'd researched how Americans were sorting themselves, choosing to live in neighborhoods, cities, or regions that reflect only their own personal values. Yes, it is wonderful to find our tribe and enjoy the benefits of bonding with others like ourselves. But if that's our primary interface with the world, our view soon becomes rather narrow. We lose out on the opportunity to have nuanced discussions with people who can give us fresh insight, or at least help us understand why they vote or live or worship the way they do. Bishop noted that mixed company moderates opinions, and Patel goes on to assert that diversity becomes positive when we organize cooperation for the common good. This is why I say interfaith could save our lives, by helping us learn to listen to each other, to not be threatened by our differences. Many say to me, well, why religion? I'm not really religious anymore, or I consider myself spiritual but unaffiliated with a particular religion. And they ask why we don't include their chosen social justice cause in our IPSC mission. So here's something to consider. Gregory Sterling of Yale Divinity School said, and I think he was quoting a colleague, I used to think that the greatest problems that we face in terms of the environment were the loss of biodiversity, deforestation, and climate change. I thought we could solve those with 30 good years of science, but I was wrong. The greatest problems we face are greed, apathy, and a lack of initiative to actually address the problems that we know exist. We scientists don't know how to do that. That's what religion can do. Religion can motivate people and move them to act in interests that may transcend their own personal interest to a broader communal interest. End of quote. So there's an old parable about some fish. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming in the other direction. And he nods at them. He says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And they go on, swim for a while, and then one of the younger ones turns to the other and he says, "What the heck is water?" It's been said that the first job of a leader is to define reality. The reality is that South Carolina is a marvelous mosaic of more ways to encounter the divine that I can count. Recent news reports indicate many people are currently moving to South Carolina for a variety of reasons. One of those being that we're a welcoming state full of Southern hospitality and accepting others, which you said, yes. We're part of the wonderful melting pot, that proverbial melting pot that represents what the U.S. stands for. But if you've never been someone practicing a very small or misunderstood or even unknown religion in South Carolina, let me tell you a little bit about living in a reality that most people, like those two young fish, take for granted. In my many encounters I've had with different faith groups, I've been asked, "Where do you get your morals?" I should have quoted Madison, shouldn't I? Oh, Miss Chu's gone. Where do you get your morals? Somebody visiting my home and seeing my altar, which holds several sacred figures, said, "But you still believe in one God, right?" Well, if I had $1 for every time I've heard, "Well, we all worship the same God by different names, don't we?" No, we don't. Please don't say that anymore. Because whether or not we do believe that is not the point. The point is that such thinking dismisses the deeply held religious convictions of others who are different from us. And what might we be missing by trying to neatly sweep others into the categories with which we're already comfortable? Without religious freedom, freedom of all religions or no religion, we do not see the flourishing of civic discussion. We are not challenged to consider how our actions may affect the lives of people we do not understand. Without religious freedom, there would not be the wonderful array of Christian denominations and movements that enrich our lives in South Carolina. Our founders and those who wrote our founding documents fully understood the extreme value of religious liberty. And we live and work together in peace here. Without religious freedom, Columbia would not be home to at least 5 Muslim congregations and at least 3 Hindu temples. South Carolina would not have one of the largest Baha'i populations in this country. I'm pleased to note the presence of my Jewish colleague here today from Charleston, where it is said the oldest continuously operating synagogue in the U.S. exists. I think there's some argument with Boston about that, but we can frame it. South Carolina is home to the groups, to IFA groups, Native American spirituality practice, Kemetic, Santeria, New Thought, Unitarian Universalist, Greek Orthodox, Baptist Federation, Buddhist congregations, charismatic non-denominational Christians, independent and Roman Catholics, Latter-day Saints, Laotian shamans, Sufis, and mystics and devotees from so many paths. This makes me really happy to live in a state which welcomes and supports our ability to live out our faith in the way we choose. Oh, and did I mention that actual studies have shown that when people get to know about religions other than their own, Rather than feeling weaker, they report that their own faith becomes stronger. So what is our task today? I issue this challenge to all of us to see ourselves as bridge builders by demonstrating not just tolerance, but by showing respect, by building relationships with people who are not like us. There are many individuals in my lifetime who I've not really wanted to get close to, but I don't think I've ever met anyone that didn't share some basic values with me. All of us want to be safe, we want to be healthy, we'd like to be happy, we want to raise our families in peace, and most of us want to help those less fortunate than ourselves. All of us here want to live in a free, democratic society. These are things around which we can find common cause. In Interfaith Partners, we are building those relationships slowly